Part 4. What real consent looks like. Part 4 builds directly on the historical land question established in earlier sections. Land was previously shown as the central axis of state formation, dispossession, and resistance in Ethiopia. This section shifts the discussion from historical grievance to present-day governance standards. It introduces free, prior, and informed consent, FPIC, as a corrective framework to a long legacy of imposed development. In doing so, it reframes structural dispossession as a contemporary legal and ethical test, and it directly links historical land governance patterns to today's infrastructure planning and decision-making. Development without erasure. There is a convenient myth surrounding projects like Abusera Airport City. That displacement is inevitable, that consent is unrealistic, that large infrastructure can only rise through sacrifice imposed from above. This myth survives because power repeats it often. But history shows something different across Africa, Latin America, North America, and Asia. Governments and corporations have learned a costly lesson. Development imposed without consent creates resistance, instability, litigation, reputational damage, and long-term political crisis. Projects built with communities may move more slowly, but they endure longer. They generate legitimacy instead of fear, and they avoid turning citizens into obstacles on their own land. The question is no longer whether Ethiopia can build infrastructure. The real question is this: can Ethiopia modernize without reproducing the old logic of dispossession? Can development happen without erasure? Or will modernization once again mean that rural communities carry the burden while political and economic elites collect the rewards? The answer depends on one principle: consent. 19. What free, prior, and informed consent, FPIC, really means. FPIC principles breakdown. Free means no coercion, no police intimidation, no intelligence surveillance, no pressure through local officials, no threats disguised as administrative orders, no military vehicles stationed near villages during negotiations, and no demolition teams arriving before discussions are complete. Consent obtained under fear is not consent. Prior means before decisions become irreversible, before contracts are finalized, before financing is locked in, before compensation formulas are imposed, before maps are drawn behind closed doors, and before communities wake up to discover their land already allocated. Consulting people after decisions are made is not participation. It is notification. Informed means communities must receive complete and understandable information, not selective information, not promotional speeches, not vague promises about jobs and prosperity. Communities must know the exact boundaries of land acquisition, the number of households affected, the environmental risks, the compensation formulas, the relocation plans, the long-term economic consequences, and the alternatives that were rejected. This information must be available in Afaan Oromo and other local languages, because information people cannot understand is not transparency. And consent means something governments often avoid admitting: the genuine possibility of refusal, not symbolic meetings, not staged consultations, not signatures collected under pressure, not compensation offered after forced displacement becomes unavoidable. Real consent includes the right to say no. No to eviction. No to relocation. No to projects imposed without legitimacy. FPIC is not merely consultation, it is shared power, and that is precisely why so many states resist it. Free, prior, and informed consent, or FPIC, is not just a consultation meeting. It is not a signature. and it is not compensation. Under international human rights standards, communities have the collective right to decide what happens to their ancestral lands before any project begins. True consent means people are fully informed. It means decisions are made collectively through their own institutions. And most importantly, it means communities have the real right to say no. But in many affected areas of Abusera, reports emerged of intimidation, arrests, imprisonment, and heavy military deployment surrounding the project environment. Community members and local voices described fear, pressure, and restrictions on open opposition. In this context, the idea of free consent becomes deeply questionable. Although consultations were conducted, the project moved forward despite acknowledged cultural and irreversible social harm. There is no clear evidence that the Oromo people, collectively, gave their consent. Participation existed, but without a genuine option to refuse the project. Consultation was treated as consent, but consultation alone is not FPIC. Under international human rights standards, the process failed to meet the requirements of genuine free, prior and informed consent. 20. Comparative lessons the state ignored. Across the world, governments confronting indigenous and community land rights have learned that legality cannot survive without legitimacy. In Kenya, courts increasingly require meaningful public participation before major infrastructure projects proceed on community land. Large transport corridors, conservation projects, and energy developments have faced suspension or redesign after litigation. Exposed failures in consultation and compensation. The Kenyan Constitution recognized community land rights not as charity, but as constitutional protection against arbitrary dispossession. In Canada, airport expansions and resource projects affecting Indigenous territories now operate through negotiated agreements with First Nations communities. These agreements often include revenue sharing, employment guarantees, environmental monitoring powers, and permanent governance participation. The process is imperfect and frequently contested. But one principle has become unavoidable. Ignoring Indigenous consent creates political and legal instability that investors increasingly fear. Across Latin America, constitutional courts in countries such as Colombia and Ecuador have suspended mining, oil, transport, and hydroelectric projects where free, prior, and informed consent procedures were bypassed. In several cases, courts intervened even after construction had already begun. Why? Because legality does not disappear once machinery arrives, and neither do rights. These systems remain flawed. Communities still struggle. Governments still attempt to bypass safeguards. But they demonstrate a truth Ethiopian authorities continue to underestimate. Consent is workable. What fails is political will. Alternatives that were never considered. One of the most striking aspects of the Abusera Airport City project is not simply its scale. It is the absence of publicly demonstrated alternatives. No publicly accessible record shows robust evaluation of less destructive options. Incremental expansion of existing aviation infrastructure. Regional cargo hubs distributed across multiple cities. Phased development models. Joint planning with local communities, or relocation toward less densely inhabited areas with negotiated land access. Each option carried trade-offs. Each required patience. Each demanded genuine negotiation. But megaprojects are often driven by political symbolism as much as economic planning. Large projects project power. They centralize authority, attract elite investment networks, and create visible monuments of state ambition. The result is that communities frequently encounter development only as displacement, not as partnership. not as participation, but as removal. This pattern has become increasingly visible across parts of Oromiyaa, where residents facing land acquisition repeatedly report uncertainty surrounding compensation, consultation procedures, and future livelihood security. For farming communities, land is not simply an economic asset. It is social identity, historical continuity, intergenerational security, and political belonging. Removing people from land without reconstructing those systems creates long-term instability that compensation money alone cannot solve. 22. Development that stays put. Real development strengthens existing communities. It does not uproot them unnecessarily. Secure land tenure allows farmers to invest confidently in productivity, irrigation, housing, education, and local enterprise. Stable communities create stable economies. When people trust that their land rights will be respected, they become participants in development rather than victims of it. Local governance also matters. Development imposed entirely from centralized authority often produces distrust because affected communities experience decisions as external commands rather than collective choices. But where local participation is genuine, infrastructure projects gain legitimacy. Recent global development research increasingly shows that displacement-heavy megaprojects frequently underestimate long-term social costs. Livelihood destruction, urban poverty, food insecurity, social fragmentation, and intergenerational trauma. These costs rarely appear in glossy project presentations, but communities live with them for decades.